You know that feeling, right? When you hear about global poverty and it's overwhelming. All the news, the numbers.
Yeah, it's a lot. You feel kind of lost. Like, what does it all really mean? What can you even grasp?
Exactly. And you want to understand, you really do, but it's hard to see how it connects or, what the core problems actually are.
Well, that feeling is pretty much what we're diving into today. We're going beyond the usual stats and digging into a really important book, Poor Economics, by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo.
Nobel Prize winners, right?
That's them. And they really shifted things by focusing on, well, what the evidence tells us, rather than just grand theories about poverty.
Right, because so often what we get are these lazy stereotypes, these really simple answers that don't actually help.
Uh-huh. The book talks about this urge to reduce the poor to a set of cliches. It's something people have done for ages.
So our mission today, kind of following their lead, is to pull out the really key practical insights from all their research.
Yeah, we want to give listeners a clearer picture. What are the specific hurdles people face? And maybe more importantly, what are some potential solutions that might change how you think about all this?
Because the book actually offers, well, a sense of hope, doesn't it? That real progress is possible.
It absolutely does. Their core argument, backed by tons of evidence, is that we can make huge strides against poverty. Not through some magic bullet, but through lots of small, smart, tested steps.
Small steps, carefully thought out. I like that. It's about understanding the details.
Exactly. And to kind of set the scene, Duflo talks about arriving at MIT and being almost disappointed, because the extreme poverty she expected wasn't immediately obvious.
Huh. Interesting.
And Banerjee, growing up in Calcutta, had these memories of kids in really basic homes, but they always had time to play, could beat him at any sport. It adds that human dimension that gets lost in abstract talks.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's unpack some of those cliches they talk about. They mention how economics itself sometimes tries to force poverty into these neat little boxes.
Right. They even use figures in the book, figure 1 and figure 2, to kind of illustrate the two big opposing camps in the debate about what poverty really is and what drives it.
And a key concept here is the poverty trap, right? Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. So a poverty trap is basically when someone starting with very little finds it almost impossible to grow their income or wealth much.
Yeah.
But someone starting with just a bit more might find it much easier to grow quickly.
Like being stuck at the bottom of a slippery slope.
Kind of, yeah. That initial push is incredibly hard if you have almost nothing to start with.
Eh.
But they also point out if the potential for fast growth is actually highest for the very poor and then slows down, the whole trap idea might not apply everywhere.
So it's not a universal thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why their method is so crucial. They insist on testing everything empirically, looking at real data, running experiments, not just relying on broad ideas or what sounds right.
That evidence-based approach is really the core of it all.
It gives us much firmer ground for understanding.
Okay, let's move on to something really basic. Food. The common sense idea is if you're very poor, any extra money goes straight to buying more food, right?
That's what you'd think. But the evidence, it's often more complicated. They discussed this study from Maharashtra, India, back in '83.
And what did it find?
Even the poorest people, when their overall spending went up, say 1%, their spending on food only went up about 0.67%, not one for one.
Wow, so even people with incredibly low incomes weren't just pouring every extra bit into calories.
Right. It suggests their needs and priorities are more complex than just not enough food. It's not just about the quantity.
Okay, so if it's not just quantity, what is it?
Well, they look at calories versus productivity. And it's not an S shape like you might guess where more calories always equals much more productivity. It's more like an inverted L,
Mean.
meaning the biggest productivity gains happen at very low levels of intake. Once you get past a basic minimum, eating more doesn't automatically make you way more productive or able to earn more.
Ah, I see. So the idea that people are poor just because they don't eat enough,
Yeah.
that doesn't always hold up.
In many cases, no. The focus really shifts then to food quality, especially micronutrients. And this is critical for pregnant women, babies, young kids.
Because that early nutrition has long-term effects.
Huge effects. They talk about a potential S-shaped relationship between parents' income and their children's future income, specifically because of early childhood nutrition. Get the right stuff early on, and your earning potential for life goes way up.
That's a powerful link. Are there examples of interventions that work?
Oh yeah. The kidney deworming study is a classic. They found that giving kids deworming pills for 2 years instead of one led to a lifetime income gain of over $3,000 PPP.
$3,000 from deworming.
And the cost,
Mhm.
about $1.36 PPP per kid per year. Tiny cost, massive long-term benefit.
Incredible. Any others?
They mention iodized salt in India, pennies per packet. Fortified fish sauce in Indonesia, maybe $7 a year.
Yeah.
These small things can make a huge difference to health and future prospects.
So the big takeaway for policy, and maybe for us, is think quality, not just quantity, especially for kids.
Exactly. Food policy needs to be smarter, more focused on delivering those vital micronutrients cost-effectively. It changes how you might think about, say, charitable giving, too. Supporting those specific interventions could have a massive impact.
Okay, let's pivot to health more broadly. Malaria comes up a lot, doesn't it?
It does. And there's this big debate, does malaria cause poverty, like Jeffrey Sachs argues?
Oh.
Or is the fact that countries can't get rid of it just a symptom of deeper problems, like poor government?
Chicken and egg thing.
Right. If it's just a symptom, then getting rid of malaria might not fix the underlying poverty drivers.
So what does the evidence say? Did getting rid of malaria actually help economically?
Well, studies looking at places that successfully eradicated malaria are pretty compelling. They compare areas that used to have high malaria rates with low-rate areas before and after eradication. And kids born after eradication in the high malaria areas basically caught up in education and earnings later in life. They closed the gap with kids from the low malaria areas.
Wow. So it really suggests malaria was holding them back economically.
It strongly points that way. One study in the U.S. South and Latin America estimated that adults who grew up malaria-free earned something like 50% more annually.
50%, that's huge.
Yeah, and similar findings, maybe different numbers, but same direction, came from India, Paraguay, Sri Lanka too. Investing in malaria control isn't just health spending, it's serious economic development.
Makes sense. And it's not just malaria, right? Basic stuff like clean water.
Absolutely. The book highlights work like Joe Mediev's Gram Vikas in India, showing that community-led water and sanitation projects can be done affordably. It doesn't always need massive top-down infrastructure.
Okay, but here's a puzzle. Why do the poor sometimes avoid free public health care and go to private doctors or even traditional healers, even though it costs them money?
Yeah, that's a really crucial counterintuitive point they explore, especially using research from Udaipur in India.
What did they find there?
Well, work by Jishnu Das and Jeffrey Hammer found healthcare quality wasn't great. In either sector, public or private, they have this 3-3-3 rule.
333.
Median visit, 3 minutes. Provider asks maybe 3 questions, quick check. Prescribes about 3 medicines. Very little follow-up, few referrals. And often, the free public clinics were actually worse.
So even free care might be really low quality, pushing people away.
That seems to be a big part of it. But there's more. People often want something tangible, immediate, like getting a shot, an injection. They feel like something is being done.
Even if the shot isn't medically necessary.
Right. Plus, understanding health advice can be hard, and public clinics often don't build that trust or take the time. And think about self-limiting illnesses, like a cold or flu.
Okay.
If you get sick, go to a private provider, get a shot, and then naturally get better in a few days anyway. You might think the shot cured you, even if it did nothing.
So it reinforces the belief in that treatment, even if it's not effective. People are paying for the feeling of being treated.
That seems to be part of the psychology. Which leads to this fascinating experiment. Siva Mandir in Udaipur. They tried giving incentives for immunizations.
Incentives, like cash.
Simpler. A bag of dal-dried beans and a couple of steel plates for completing the full immunization schedule for your child.
Just for getting all the shots. And did it work?
It works spectacularly. Full immunization rates increased 7-fold.
7 times higher. For some beans and plates?
Yep. The value was pretty small, less than half a day's wage. It showed the problem wasn't necessarily deep resistance to vaccines. Initial uptake was okay.
So what was the barrier then?
It was likely about follow-through, completing the whole course. Maybe present bias focusing on today's hassles over future benefits, or maybe just forgetting the appointments. The small, immediate reward made a huge difference.
That's incredible. It shows how these small behavioral nudges can be so powerful.
Exactly. It's about making the right thing easier to do, which kind of leads us into education.
Right. Another area where just providing the service, like building schools, isn't always enough.
Definitely. The book tells this story of a mother in rural India. Free schools nearby, but her older kids still dropped out. Infrastructure isn't everything.
But didn't Duflo's own research in Indonesia show that building schools did help increased wages?
It did, yes. Access matters. Building schools led to about an 8% wage increase per extra year of primary school. But the challenge now is often about learning inside those schools. Enrollment is up globally, but are kids actually learning?
What stops them learning effectively?
A few things. Parental expectations can be a factor. If parents think only university-level education really pays off that S-shaped belief again, they might underinvest early on.
Believing the early years don't matter as much.
Kind of. Then there's the school system itself. Often it's elitist, maybe a leftover from colonial times. The curriculum focuses on tough exam to filter out kids, rather than making sure everyone gets the basics.
So it's designed to find the top few, not lift everyone up.
Often, yes. And then you have practical problems like teacher absenteeism, which the PRB report in India found was a huge issue, and teachers just having low expectations for poor kids. If the teacher doesn't show up or doesn't believe in you, how can you learn?
It sounds pretty bleak. Are there any hopeful examples in education?
Oh, absolutely. There's this amazing story from Israel. Ethiopian Jewish kids airlifted there in '91. They came from families with almost no formal education.
Okay.
They were put in Israeli schools alongside Israeli kids and Russian immigrant kids. Years later, guess what?
They struggled.
Nope. Their educational results were remarkably similar to the Russian kids. It showed that severe disadvantage can be overcome with the right school environment and support.
Wow. So the school environment really can level the playing field.
It has huge potential. And this connects to the idea of teaching at the right level, or TARL.
Tarell, what's that?
It's about focusing first on ensuring kids master the absolute basics reading, basic math before moving on, using tech to help, letting kids learn at their own pace.
Making sure the foundation is solid.
Exactly. Some worry it creates a two-tier system, but the argument is the current system already fails so many kids by not even getting them the basics. So this is about fixing that fundamental problem first.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears again. Family size, big families, poverty often linked in people's minds, right?
Very much so. The classic idea is the quality-quantity trade-off from Gary Becker. More kids means fewer resources per child for health, education, etc.
Sounds logical. Fewer kids, more investment in each one.
It seems logical, but the research, again, it's complicated. Studies looked at things like twin births or the gender mix of kids, things that change family size unexpectedly.
Did having fewer kids strongly correlate with better outcomes for those kids?
Not consistently, no. When you control for those surprise changes in family size, the link between smaller families and much better educated kids isn't always that strong.
So maybe families who choose fewer kids are different in other ways that also affect education.
That's likely part of it. It's not a simple cause and effect.
Yeah.
Then there's the whole supply versus demand thing for contraception. Is it just lack of access? Or do people want larger families?
What does the evidence suggest there?
Well, a study in Bangladesh that gave people subsidized contraception did lead to lower fertility. So access definitely matters.
But even with access, why might poor families choose to have more kids?
Several big reasons. One is old age security. If there's no reliable pension or social safety net, having children is your insurance policy for when you're old.
Like the example in the book, Sudarna wanting 9 kids, so at least one would care for him.
Exactly. Children can also be like informal insurance within the wider family or community.
Right.
There's an example from Côte d'Ivoire. Husbands might give wives extra resources in good harvest years, kind of banking goodwill for leaner times. And social rules matter too, like that male yam crop in Côte d'Ivoire, specifically set aside for basic family needs and the kids.
Wow. It's a whole complex system of social and economic factors, not just a simple decision.
Definitely. Which brings us to another constant factor.
Oh.
Risk.
Right. Life for the poor is often incredibly risky, isn't it? Farming depends on weather, jobs are insecure, health shocks, crime, corruption.
It's pervasive. And interestingly, sometimes big economic crises, like the 2008 financial meltdown, seem to have a less dramatic immediate impact on the very poor.
Why is that? Because life is already so uncertain day to day.
That seems to be part of it.
Yeah.
The book mentions journalist Samini Sengupta trying to report on the crisis's impact in India. She found resilience, people still migrating for work. Not the immediate collapse you might expect, but that doesn't mean shocks don't matter.
No.
No, because a single big shock can create a poverty trap, like Ibu Tina, whose sewing business got wiped out by theft. That one event pushed her back drastically, and perhaps permanently.
So while they navigate daily risk, a major hit can be devastating and hard to recover from. What about formal insurance then? Seems like a solution.
You think so?
Yeah.
But uptake is often really low, even when people understand the basic idea.
Why? Lack of trust. Too complicated.
Trust is a big one. Lack of trust in the companies and the process. And interestingly, small behavioral things seem to matter more than fancy marketing,
Like what?
like simple home visits to explain things, or doing baseline surveys that subtly remind people of the risks they face. These small nudges often increase take-up more than anything else.
Again, it's the small human touches that make the difference. Okay, let's talk microfinance. Huge buzz around that for years.
Massive buzz. The Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus, the narrative was powerful. Small loans to break free from exploitative moneylenders.
And the group lending model using social pressure for repayment seemed clever.
It was clever, and MFIs definitely offered better rates than local moneylenders, maybe 25% a year versus 100%, 200%, or even more. Huge reach too, millions of clients, low default rates usually.
Sounds great. So did it solve poverty?
Well, that's where the evidence gets murky. Despite the success in lending and repayment, rigorous studies showing a large-scale, long-term reduction in poverty because of microfinance. They're surprisingly thin on the ground.
Really? So it helped people manage finances, maybe smooth consumption, but didn't necessarily lift masses out of poverty.
That seems closer to the reality for many. And there were downsides too. Remember the Andhra Pradesh crisis in India around 2010?
Vaguely. What happened?
After a big MFI went public, there were allegations of really aggressive collection tactics, pressure, even links to suicides. It was a wake-up call about potential harms.
A reminder that good intentions aren't enough. But wasn't there another perspective in the book from Padmaja Reddy?
Yes, the founder of Spendana. Her take was interesting. She saw microfinance's value not just as a poverty cure-all, but as giving people a way to plan, to envision a better future, to work towards something. It's about agency.
Empowering people to plan and invest, even small amounts.
Right. Though the book also notes MFIs struggle to provide the larger loans needed for businesses to really scale up and create lots of jobs.
Which leads into behavioral economics, right? This idea that the poor are maybe impatient, lack self-control.
That's a common perception, but the book really pushes back on it. Self-control is hard for everyone.
True.
The difference is wealthier people often have systems that automate good choices. Automatic savings, retirement plans.
Right. It's easier when the system helps you.
Exactly. Whereas if you're poor, juggling tiny amounts of money, unpredictable income, it's incredibly demanding just to manage day-to-day. Long-term planning becomes really hard.
So it's the circumstances that make it harder, not necessarily the person.
That's the argument. And it explains why nudges work. Fortified salt is the default. Automatic enrollment in savings, making the good choice the easy choice.
Like the immunization incentive.
Precisely. And there's this anecdote about Ben Sedan, the cow herder.
What about him?
It illustrates that just giving business advice might miss the point if you don't understand the person's real constraints and perspective. Entrepreneurship is common among the poor, but many businesses stay tiny, barely profitable.
So just telling people to be entrepreneurs isn't the answer.
Not always, no. What often makes a huge difference, the book argues, are good jobs.
Meaning?
Steady, decently paid work, maybe with benefits. The kind of job that provides stability. They cite examples like a zinc factory opening in rural Udaipur, and studies showing kids were taller if their mothers worked in maquiladoras in Mexico. Stable jobs have these ripple effects on health, education, everything.
It's about creating pathways to stability, not just survival.
Exactly. Which finally brings us to institutions, the bigger picture.
Right, because markets alone can't solve everything, like pollution or immunization. And governments in poor countries can be weak or corrupt.
Huge challenges there. But again, there are glimmers of hope. Even flawed local elections, like in China, seem to increase accountability a bit.
So local democracy can matter, even if imperfect.
It seems so. The book also points out the damage ethnic politics can do, like in Uttar Pradesh, India. But it also shows that good policies can change things.
Like what?
Like reserving seats for women in Indian village councils that change spending priorities. Or the Progressive program in Mexico, which tied cash aid to health visits and school attendance that actually increased people's civic engagement too.
So policies can actually change behavior and even attitudes over time.
The evidence suggests they can. It's about understanding the context, avoiding one-size-fits-all solutions, and focusing on what works on the ground.
Okay, so wrapping things up, what's the big overarching message from Poor Economics?
I think it's really about changes at the margin. Progress doesn't have to be some giant revolution. It often comes from really understand the details of poor people's lives, their choices, their constraints, and then making small, smart, evidence-based changes.
Those nudges, the better information, the well-designed incentives.
Exactly. Things that make it easier for people to make choices that benefit them. The book puts it starkly. The richer you are, the more the right decisions are kind of made for you by the systems around you.
So a key part of tackling poverty is making it easier for the poor to also make those right decisions.
That's a huge part of it.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the main takeaways for listeners. First, poverty is complex, context matters. Ditch the simple stereotypes.
Second, evidence is king. Test interventions rigorously. Don't just assume what works.
Third, small nudges. Understanding behavior, they can have a really big impact. Psychology matters.
Fourth, listen. Understand the specific challenges and incentives people face from their perspective.
Fifth, basics first. Foundational education, core health needs, especially for kids, these have massive long-term payoffs.
Sixth, microfinance helps some, but it's not a magic bullet. Be aware of its limits and potential downsides.
Seventh, good, stable jobs, transformative for families, for communities. Focus on creating those pathways.
And finally, institutions matter, even imperfect ones. Local accountability, smart policies, they can make a real difference over time.
So as everyone listening goes about their day, maybe take a second to think critically about assumptions you hold about poverty. Use the kind of evidence we've talked about today.
Yeah, and maybe a final thought to leave people with. Based on all this, what's just one small assumption you have about poverty or inequality that might be worth revisiting? Digging into the evidence, like Banerjee and Duflo did, can really change your perspective and reveal pathways for change you hadn't considered. Maybe even pick up the book.